Imagine waking up in a cold stone monastery 800 years ago. You reach for your toothbrush, but it isn't plastic. It's a twig snapped off a hazel tree. You watch a tired monk sit on a wooden bench, fraying the end of the stick with a knife until it turns into rough fibers. He vigorously rubs his jagged, chewed stick against his yellow teeth, spitting bits of wood and brown saliva onto the floor. But here's the strange part. This wasn't just for cleaning. To finish the job, a noblewoman in a drafty manner picks up a cup of warm wine mixed with vinegar. She swills the acidic liquid around her mouth, her face wincing at the sharp sting, before spitting it into a brass bowl. And then it gets worse. If her teeth still feel filmy, she dips her finger into a pile of black soot and charred bread crusts. She rubs a gritty black powder directly onto her gums, turning her entire mouth into a dark, muddy mess. What happened next was even more physical. A mother takes a strip of coarse linen cloth, wraps it tightly around her finger, and forcefully scours her child's teeth to scrub away the remains of the thick stew. If the pain became too much, they didn't see a dentist. They saw a tooth drawer in the village square. You see him holding a smoking candle to a man's open mouth, waiting for a toothworm to crawl out of the gums. When the worms didn't appear, the merchant next door simply chewed on raw parsley and cloves, desperately trying to mask the scent of rot before a trade deal. Finally, when the pain turned into a fever, a blacksmith stepped in with heavy iron pliers. He braces his foot against a chair and pulls until the rotted tooth snaps out. This was the brutal reality of a medieval smile. Imagine finishing a heavy meal in a drafty stone manor and reaching for your mouthwash, but instead of mint, it's a cup of stinging vinegar. You watch a noblewoman tilt her head back and take a massive swig of warm wine mixed with sharp acid. She swills the liquid aggressively until her cheeks puff out, her face contorting in pain from the sour burn. But here's the strange part. She isn't doing this for the taste. She's trying to kill the bacteria on her gums. She finally spits the dark mixture into a decorative brass bowl held by a silent servant. And then it gets worse. If the wine rinse didn't scrub away the grime, she would reach for something much grittier. You see her dip her finger into a pile of black soot and salt, rubbing the abrasive powder directly onto her teeth until her smile is covered in dark sludge. What happened next was even more intense. A local merchant, worried about his breath before a big sale, grabs a handful of raw cloves and dry parsley. He crunches down on the bitter herbs, chewing them into a thick green paste that stains his lips. But the real shock comes when the cleaning fails. A peasant with swollen, throbbing jaw sits in the middle of a muddy village square. Instead of a doctor, a barber-surgeon approaches him with a pair of rusted iron pliers. The surgeon braces his foot against the man's chest and pulls with all his weight. What happened next was unexpected. As the tooth snaps out, the crowd cheers, believing the evil humors have finally been released. This was the violent, stinging reality of keeping a clean mouth in the Middle Ages. Imagine standing in a smoky blacksmith's workshop, where the air is thick with the smell of burning coal. You see a young apprentice reach into a bowl filled with crushed, charred bread crusts and coarse salt. He dips his blackened finger into the gritty soot and begins rubbing it hard against his yellow teeth. But here's the strange part. He is actually trying to whiten his smile using jet black charcoal. He scours his gums until his mouth is covered in a dark, muddy smear that looks more like rot than a cleaning routine. And then it gets worse. While the apprentice uses soot, a noblewoman in a nearby manor house turns to something even more abrasive. She wraps a piece of rough linen cloth around her finger and dips it into a mixture of crushed seashells and vinegar. She scrubs her teeth so forcefully that her gums begin to bleed, believing that the stinging and the red blood are signs that the bad air is leaving her mouth. What happened next was unexpected. Instead of rinsing with water, she takes a mouthful of strong, herbal wine and swills it around to wash away the grit, spitting a purple, muddy liquid into a basin. But for those who couldn't afford wine, the struggle was even more intense. You see a farmer standing in a muddy field, plucking a handful of sage leaves and rubbing them directly onto his enamel until the green juice stains his lips. He isn't doing this with flavor. He is desperately trying to mask the scent of the onions and dried fish he ate for breakfast. If these daily rituals failed, the solution was brutal. A barber-surgeon would step in, not with a brush, but with heavy iron pliers to rip a rotted tooth out in front of a staring crowd. This was the gritty, painful reality of medieval dental care. Imagine stepping into a cramped, timber-framed cottage where the only light comes from a small fire. You see a mother grab a strip of rough, unwashed linen cloth and wrap it tightly around her index finger. She pins her squirming child against a wooden stool and begins forcefully scouring his teeth with the dry fabric. She isn't using any soap or bubbles. She is using pure physical friction to scrape away the sticky film left behind by a bowl of thick vegetable pottage. But here's the strange part. This painful rubbing was the only way to keep teeth from rotting out by age 20. And then it gets worse. If the cloth wasn't rough enough to remove the grime, people turned to the fireplace for help. You see a blacksmith's apprentice dip his finger into a pile of cold, gritty ash and charred bread crusts. He rubs the black soot directly into his gums, creating a dark, muddy smear across his mouth as he tries to polish his enamel. What happened next was unexpected. Instead of rinsing with fresh water, a noblewoman in a nearby manor house takes a swig of warm, acidic wine mixed with vinegar. She swills the burning liquid around her mouth until her face contorts, spitting the purple foam into a brass bowl held by a servant. But when the scrubbing and the stinging rinses failed, the situation turned violent. You see a man with a swollen, red face sitting in the middle of a busy market square. A barber-surgeon approaches him, not with cloth, but with a pair of heavy iron pliers. The surgeon braces his knee against the man's chest and yanks backward with all his might to rip a rotted tooth from the bleeding gum. There were no painkillers and no soft bristles, just rough fabric, burning vinegar, and a constant threat of pliers. This was the brutal, daily battle for a clean mouth. Imagine standing in a noisy village square, surrounded by the smell of mud and wood smoke. You see a terrified peasant leaning back against a stone wall, while a barber-surgeon towers over him. The surgeon isn't reaching for a medical tool. Instead, he lights a thick tallow candle and holds a flickering flame inches away from the man's open mouth. He believes that the heat will lure out tiny, invisible worms eating the patient's gums. But here's the strange part. The surgeon watches for worms to drop out, which were actually just charred bits of onion seed he hid in the candle smoke to trick the patient. And then it gets worse. When the worms don't leave, the treatment becomes a physical struggle. You see a mother in a timber-framed cottage grabbing a rough strip of linen and wrapping it around her thumb. She pins her child down and vigorously scours the boy's teeth, trying to scrape away the day's pottage with nothing but dry, scratching fabric. What happened next was unexpected. A noblewoman nearby reaches for a cup of warm, sour wine mixed with vinegar. She swills the stinging liquid until her eyes water, spitting the purple mixture into a brass bowl to burn away the decay. But if the vinegar and the candles failed, the barber-surgeon returned with his most feared tool. You see him pull a pair of heavy iron pliers from a leather pouch. He braces his boot against the patient's chair and yanks with his entire body weight until a bloody tooth snaps free from the jaw. There was no numbing cream and no modern medicine, just smoke, fire, and a constant fear of the toothworm. This was a bizarre and painful reality of medieval dental care. Imagine walking through a bustling medieval market where the air smells of wet wool and rotting fish. You see a merchant in a stained linen tunic reach into his leather satchel and pull out a handful of raw green parsley and dried cloves. He stuffs the herbs into his mouth and chews slowly, his jaw moving rhythmically as he tries to mask the heavy scent of onions and tooth decay before a big trade meeting. But here's the strange part. Even 800 years ago, people were terrified of bad breath ruining their social status. And then it gets worse. If herbs couldn't hide the smell, people turned to more aggressive tools. You see a blacksmith's apprentice sitting in a smoky workshop, dipping his finger into a pile of cold ash and charred bread crusts. He rubs the black, gritty soot directly onto his gums, creating a dark smear across his mouth as he tries to polish his teeth. What happened next was unexpected. A noblewoman in a nearby manor house finishes her dinner and takes a massive swig of warm wine mixed with vinegar. She swills the stinging liquid around her mouth until her face contorts in pain, spitting the purple mixture into a brass bowl held by a servant. But when the cleaning failed, the situation became a public spectacle. You see a barber-surgeon in the middle of a village square holding a smoking tallow candle near a patient's open mouth. He waits for toothworms to crawl out of the man's gums, convinced that heat is the only way to lure the parasites out. If the smoke didn't work, He would simply grab a pair of heavy iron pliers, brace his foot against a man's chest, and rip the rotted tooth out in front of the staring crowd. This was the brutal, daily reality of trying to maintain a medieval smile. Imagine sitting in a wooden chair in the middle of a muddy village, your face so swollen and red that you can barely open your eyes. You aren't waiting for a doctor, but for the local blacksmith who is wiping his hands on a greasy leather apron. He reaches into a bucket of rusted tools and pulls out a pair of heavy iron pliers. But here's the strange part. This was the only dentist available when your morning routine of scrubbing with twigs finally failed. The blacksmith braces one heavy boot against the frame of your chair and grips your rotted molar with the cold metal pincers. And then it gets worse. As he yanks backward with his entire body weight, there is no numbing medicine or anesthesia to dull the sensation. You see the man's knuckles turn white as he pulls, and the patient lets out a muffled scream that echoes through the market square. What happened next was unexpected. Once the bloody tooth is finally ripped free, the blacksmith doesn't offer a bandage. He simply hands the patient a cup of strong, stinging vinegar to wash out the wound. This brutal moment was a final stop for everyone, from peasants to kings. Before this disaster, a merchant might have spent his morning chewing on raw parsley and cloves to hide the smell of decay from his customers. A noblewoman might have spent her evening swilling warm wine and acid around her gums, hoping the burning would stop the rot. But when the linen cloths and the charcoal soot failed to save the enamel, the iron pliers were the only solution left. It was a world where a simple toothache could lead to a life-or-death struggle in a blacksmith's chair. This was the terrifying reality of the medieval smile.